And to talk more about that, to understand the developments between the talks between President Putin and President Trump, and also President Trump's phone call with President Zelensky, I'm joined on the show by Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri. He's a former senior diplomat, has served as our ambassador in various capacities. Sir, pleasure to have you on the show. Ambassador, what should we make of what transpired today? Both President Trump's talks with President Putin and later his 1.5 hour long phone call with President Zelensky and other European leaders joining in. No clear outcomes, no deal there, but yet the rhetoric at least seems to be toned down.
Absolutely, Amritpal. Thank you very much. And for someone who was recently in the northwestern part of the American continent, perhaps you are in the best position to understand whether the ice thawed or not. But let me say what everybody is saying, that President Trump didn't give away anything. So there was nothing about what was talked about, land sharing and so on and so forth, Ukraine having to give up anything. Nothing of that happened. On the other hand, did President Putin not score some diplomatic successes? After all, somebody who's been shunned by the West for more than 10 years, landing on the soil of the United States, being welcomed by the President of the United States, and then and riding in his limousine, etc. So, there are optics and there are various things to it. He didn't agree on a ceasefire, which was not something he wanted to. He proposed this idea of a peace agreement, which is a long-term thing, and, let's see what happens. But I want to make a simple point here. Look, the Europeans and, of course, President Zelensky and the Ukrainians were very worried that President Trump might give them away in a sense. He did. So they have reason to be somewhat assuaged that didn't happen. President Trump had a long phone call with President Zelensky. He's meeting him on Monday. He's also spoken with European leaders. So, in that sense, there isn't much which has been lost on their front, on that side. What's been happening between the United States and Russia is a different matter that, of course, certainly worries the West. But that's a different subject. President Trump is interested in business. The Russians certainly want to reset their relationship, in particular with the United States. So all that is, what should I say? It has lowered the temperature. Let's agree to that. American commentators are saying President Trump hasn't lost, Putin has won. But, that's fine. The important things are that in various ways, things have moved forward on this very intractable situation. And I think that's to be welcomed. And I'm glad that's exactly what the Ministry of External Affairs has said. Amritpal, if I may.
Yes, sir.
Preempt you. Look, one of the great concerns we had was that if things go really bad here, we could have Scott Bessent's dire words coming true, that not only that 25% penalty of China, but much more could get imposed on a country like India, which wants to exert its strategic autonomy and which we've been buying oil from Russia. That hasn't happened. In that sense, the cooling of the temperature is not a bad idea, and that's why we welcomed it. And that's the way I should say we should look at it. Win, lose in these kind of summits, these things keep happening. There's talk now of a second summit on Russian soil. We'll see what happens.
Yes, I just want to briefly comment on the Indian statement before we go back to what transpired in Alaska today and on that phone call on that Air Force One plane. The Indian statement is very clear that one, it supports the principled stand of which India has been consistently taking, that dialogue and diplomacy is the only way forward, and dialogue and diplomacy are difficult negotiations, but at least that has started. Second, of course, what you said, Ambassador, that if this issue gets resolved, then the whole question of secondary sanctions, etc., goes away. So that it is in the Indian interest, and that's why we see the Indian statement. But going back to the Trump-Putin meeting, both leaders, Ambassador Puri, say called the talks positive. They said, the White House calls great progress, extremely productive meeting, many points were agreed to, yet no formal agreement was reached, no commitments were made. So how should we see this? Should we see this as a first step towards working towards resolving this, or it's just lowering of temperatures? How should we see things where they stand today?
So, Amritpal, let's differentiate ourselves sitting in India from that European-centric thing that this whole business is about Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine is central. That's okay. But I think both President Trump and the President Putin, they perhaps had some other ideas. For President Putin, resetting the relationship, particularly with the United States, economic sanctions, all those matters were important. For President Trump, coming from where he is, business opportunities with Russia,
Exactly. He is saying, we'll, I think that video link with Ambassador Puri is frozen for a moment. We'll try and get him back onto this thing. But what he was saying, what Ambassador Puri was saying, that, the Europeans have their own interest, but the Americans here have their own interest. President Trump, as the President of the United States, is looking at, the American interests of trade with the Russians. So that is also playing out here. For the Europeans, of course, for the Ukrainian security guarantees is one thing, but for the Europeans, the whole question of the Russian advancement into Ukraine is a matter of security. So everybody has their own interests, their own angle in this whole quagmire. I think we've lost the link with Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri. Let me. Okay, I hear that he's back with us. Ambassador, can you hear me?
Amritpal, I can hear you loud and clear, and you did a great summation of what I was saying.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Please carry on, sir.
Yeah, these are perspectives. So, of course, Ukraine was central. We all agree on that. But as I mentioned, President Putin had some of his own ideas, and those are big ideas. A reset on relations with the United States. As far as President Trump is concerned, coming from where he is, business opportunities beckon. And Russia has a huge economy. Why not do that particularly? So, there are different things. Of course, neither could simply brush aside Ukraine. That's not possible. In fact, President Putin, in his statement, said we have to look after the interests of Russia, and then added, of course, the Ukrainian interest also has to be looked after. And President Trump, certainly over the last several days, was clearly reminded by everyone that, Ukraine is central and you can't sort of, let me say, throw it under the bus. And he didn't do. So the Europeans, Ukrainians have a reason to feel that, look, whatever were the apprehensions, that didn't happen. That's good. President Trump thinks that he's opened a line to a great power who thinks is an important issue. There are other issues in Russia. There's this nuclear arms control treaty, which is expiring next year. There are various other issues. But, President Putin certainly has a great interest in somehow or the other trying to reset that relationship with the United States. And, if the United States gets reset, many Europeans will find reason to reset their relationship with the Russians, at least in some kind of a practical form, oil, hydrocarbons exports, overflight. Remember one simple thing. Somebody said that one of the reasons why Alaska was chosen was that the Russians didn't have to overfly any European airspace. Now, whether that would have been a problem is a different matter. But, think about this. The symbolism of Alaska, which used to be Russian territory, the islands of the US and the Russians in that particular sea are barely 2 miles apart. And in fact, the mainlands are only 50 miles. So those symbolisms are apart. There are different, let me say, objectives of different people. All in all, I would say that this isn't a great summit with a tremendous outcome, no. But it's lower temperature. As far as we are concerned, there's some hope on positivity that if something happens, the kinds of things that many people in India were fearing a few weeks and so, that would come down. In various ways, let's also understand that in Ukraine and in other parts, there is a certain degree of tiredness with war. So is it the case with Russia. Can a way forward be found out without compromising territorial integrity, etc.? Is that possible? Looks difficult, but certainly something can be done. A positive step up, I would say.
So what happens next now? What happens, what transpires on Monday when President Zelensky is there at the Oval Office? What is President Trump going to tell him? Also, the Europeans have called a meeting tomorrow. The French President, the German Chancellor and the UK Prime Minister ahead. In fact, the French presidency said that the coalition of the willing will meet and Europe cannot be left out if any meaningful solution has to be found. So what are the Europeans going to angle at?
Amritpal, first, just look at what everyone was saying before this summit. A summit about the Europeans, and the Europeans are missing. Look at their state of play, the so-called allies of the United States. It's about Ukraine, and the Ukrainians are not entertained. That's what people were saying. Well, at least they got discussed. President Trump has called President Zelensky, long phone call. We don't have many details of it other than what he has posted on Truth Social. President Zelensky is coming to the White House. I'm sure he will explain to him in detail what happened on the issue of Ukraine during the 2.5-hour, 3-hour meeting that he had with President Putin. Look, I have little doubt that he will also urge him that, look, it's important to enter into some kind of a deal, if I use a word which President Trump likes using, an agreement. That agreement is not an easy one for President Zelensky to agree to, because it means territorial concessions, etc. Not very easy to do. It's very easy to talk about them. But can they try and find some kind of practical way forward? But he will also assure President Zelensky that, look, he is not, if I use that colloquial kind of expression, ditching him, throwing him under the bus. No, not at all. He is mindful of the importance of Ukraine, Ukrainian sovereignty, etc. And he's trying to secure what he says is the best deal for them. After all, if I use his expression, thousands are dying. So many Ukrainians have lost their life. And I believe the latest Gallup poll in Ukraine said that more than 66% of the Ukrainians simply want an end to the war. And they are tired. So he will try and stress those particular things, try and tell him, look, I have your back, but, be ready to do a deal. That's what he would try and convince them. The Europeans, there would be the other thing that, look, you need to have a deal. It's good for you. If it requires security guarantees, please step up to the table. Please do your bit. You are spending now more on NATO. Please do much more on all of this. So they are calling a meeting of themselves to try and take stock of where the situation is. And then let's see what happens.
Okay. So now all eyes would be on that Monday meeting at the Oval Office. Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri, thank you so much for lending us your insights. That's all the time I have for. Otherwise, I would love to talk more about it. Thank you for joining in.